Idaho Matters podcast is brought to you by St. Luke's On-Demand Virtual Care, which allows patients to see a provider from their home using a computer or smartphone with on-demand care for common ailments such as a cough, sore throat, or a sinus issue. More information at stlukesonline.org.
Hundreds of bills move through the Idaho legislature each session, and it can be hard to keep track of what's really at stake. The Connector follows the legislation that's gaining traction with clear reporting and local context you can trust. Stay connected to the State House with The Connector, Idaho Daily News. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Gemma Gaudet. You're listening to Idaho Matters. Climate change has far-reaching effects around the globe, from environmental to economic to public health concerns, and then add in a slowing world economy and an increasing political polarization of our society, and the search for solutions can seem futile. Dr. Matt Burgess is studying how all of these things are interconnected. He's an assistant professor in the Department of Economics at the College of Business at the University of Wyoming, and he'll be speaking tomorrow on the topic of economic growth, climate change, and health at St. Luke's lecture series on climate and health. And he's joining us now to talk more. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
So, Dr. Burgess, as I mentioned, you're an economics professor. So how does your work intersect with climate change?
Basically in two areas. I study long-run economic growth trends and try to think about how they might advance into the future. And if you think that the economy is, the base of our emissions, but also the source of innovations and resources that we draw from to adapt and innovate to fix climate change, it's kind of in a way, the bottom of the problem and the solution. So that's the link there. And then political polarization is something I study, in general and specific to climate change, because people often talk about climate change as this all of society problem that needs all of society solutions. And it just seems obvious to me that you can't have an all of society solution without both parties working together in a country like ours with the two-party system.
So my understanding is that you also look at how climate change and the economy are connected to public health. So can you give us an example of how all of this fits together?
Sure. So as I said a second ago, the economy drives everything we do in society in some way or another, including emitting greenhouse gas emissions and adapting to climate change. Economic growth also affects our how much resources we have for public health, right? How much both adapting to climate change and just in general. Climate change can directly affect physical health through things like wildfire smoke, pollution, the increased risk of disease in some places, for example. Climate change, and I would argue even more so, some of the narratives around climate change have been affecting mental health, especially among young people. So those are just some of the examples of the connection between those three: climate change, the economy, and health.
So what ripple effects does economic growth or a slowing economy have on climate change and on our health?
Yeah, so some things that I look at with this slowing economy is, one, it makes our economy more zero sum. So if you had no growth, then in order for somebody to become richer, somebody else would necessarily have to become poorer. And there's emerging evidence that fuels unrest. It also creates gaps between expectations and reality. If we grew up in a time where the economy was growing faster, we might have certain expectations about how rich we would be compared to our parents. And then if it slows down, those expectations might not be met, which again can fuel unrest. It can exacerbate inequality. So if the economy is zero sum and people who are richer are better able to secure more resources for themselves, then there's some evidence that the slowing economy can correlate with higher inequality. All of these things affect polarization. They affect extremism. They affect mental health challenges. Beyond that, slowing growth puts pressure on public finances, which means, especially in an aging society like the United States, we might have to make hard choices about taxes and spending that can affect health and healthcare. on climate change, less growth, all else equal, means less emissions, but it also means less innovation. It means adaptation is more difficult. It might mean that our infrastructure is turning over more slowly, and so it's more expensive to retrofit our infrastructure to adapt and mitigate. Um, and the other thing is, so far at least, it's overwhelmingly rich countries who are reducing our emissions over the past 2 decades. And so it may be that having more growth is counterintuitively helpful to reducing emissions because it gives us more innovation, it gives us more resources to tackle the problem, and it gives us more will as we've met our kind of baser needs to devote attention to environmental protection and climate mitigation.
Mhm. So you also use mathematical models in your research. Talk to us about how these work in order to give you a clear picture of not only what's happening right now, but also potentially predicting the future when it comes to the impacts of climate change globally.
Yeah, sure. So there's when people say mathematical models, often they mean basically just fancy if-then statements, right? If we assume X, what happens? And models, mathematical models keep you honest about tracing your assumptions to your conclusions.
Mm.
So, what's going to happen to emissions, what's going to happen to growth if past trends continue, for example, is something I've looked at. There's also statistical models where you're trying to look at data to parse how does one variable affect another. So, for example, how does climate change affect the economy, or how does climate change affect public health? And that's very difficult, as is mathematical modeling, especially when you're working with something as complicated as climate change in the economy. And so, looking to the future, because you're uncertain about these relationships in the data and the assumptions you should make, there's really a lot of uncertainty about what the economic and health impact of climate change will be, I would say.
So, one of your studies looked at how maximizing the profits of commercial fisheries could actually help sea turtles and other marine mammals. So, can you talk about this particular study?
Sure. The basic idea is that some sea turtles, marine mammals, and seabirds are endangered because fisheries catch them by accident. Most places we're
Mm-hmm.
not catching sea turtles on purpose to eat them and sell them, but they are attracted to some of the same bait, for example, that fish are that we are trying to catch. And so this seems on the surface like an area where fishery profits trade off with protecting these species because the way to reduce mortality from accidental catch is to fish less. But what we found is that actually a lot of the fisheries that are catching turtles and mammals and birds are fishing harder than they would need to maximize their profits. Because if you fish too hard, you deplete your fish population, and then you're not making a lot of revenue for the effort that you're out there fishing. And so we calculated that if every fishery in the world just cut back to the level of effort that maximized profits and didn't even worry about these accidental catches, that of the 20 endangered mammals, turtles, and birds we looked at, you'd actually save about half of them just by fishing at the profit maximizing level. And so that our interpretation of that was this isolates which are the species where there really is a trade-off between the fishery and protecting the species, and which is a situation where actually, if we just fished a little bit less hard, both the fishery and the species would benefit.
So, you were also part of a study that looked at how liberals were less likely to buy Teslas once Elon Musk adopted a more conservative public persona. So, talk to us a little bit about this and about how politics can influence the decisions that folks make, in particular when it comes to climate change.
Yeah, so this study started, 2.5 years ago. Our original idea was to look to see which individual behaviors or household behaviors that reduce your household emissions are the most polarizing, meaning, liberals have a greater intention of doing it in the near future than conservatives. And so we did a survey where we found that electric vehicle buying was one of the most polarizing actions where liberals were significantly more likely to say that they wanted to do it. And this was just around the time Elon Musk had bought Twitter, now X, about a year before. He was, I think, starting to explicitly endorse Republican political candidates. And we thought Our initial hypothesis actually was that, maybe Elon Musk by creating a conservative coded brand might bring conservatives to want to buy more electric vehicles. And so we reran
Hmm.
our study several times, from 2023 to March 2025, right after inauguration. Um, and where we asked half the participants a bunch of questions about household behaviors, including would you buy an EV, and half the same set except would you buy a Tesla. And we found, and then after that, sorry, we asked them if they what they thought about Elon Musk in a bunch of different dimensions. And basically, what we found is that liberals were significantly less likely to say that they wanted to buy a Tesla. Conservatives pretty much were equally likely or unlikely to buy Teslas or EVs. And it was specifically liberals and moderates who disliked Elon Musk that were driving the effect between the difference between the electric vehicle and the Tesla treatment. And then in our last survey, which ran in March 2025, we actually found that liberals and moderates who disliked Elon Musk were now even a little bit less likely than they were in previous surveys to want to buy an EV at all. So it's almost like
Hmm.
the effect was so strong that it had turned them a little bit off of EVs in general. Those are, surveys are hypotheticals, but we did in our study, and there's actually another study that came up more recently from another group that sees evidence of this pattern in real sales data, where basically this other study found that liberal counties that are kind of liberal strongholds had a drop in their rate of Tesla uptake compared to other places.
Okay, but I want to go back to something that you said
Mhm.
um that it even began you began to see that people didn't want to buy EVs at all. Because that was going to be my next question. Well, was it just liberals saying I don't want to buy a Tesla, but I'll still buy an electric vehicle? But it seems that there's this trickle down effect and that ultimately affects climate change, right? If there
Mhm.
are less electric vehicles on the road.
That's right. And one of the things that was interesting about our study is that it was reported on in a wide range of media outlets, ranging from, very left, Daily Beast, I believe, to very right, Breitbart. And depending on your politics, you sort of had a different take on it, right? So some of
Mhm.
the reactions that we saw among liberals were, to the effect of, haha, Elon, you wrecked your car brand. But then conservatives were sometimes saying, oh, look at these liberals who claim to believe in helping the planet, but as soon as it gets in the way of their politics, they're not willing to do it anymore. So those are kind of different interpretations of our study. The trickle down effect, we saw that particularly in the last survey. We didn't see it in the earlier ones, and it was smaller than kind of the direct effect on Tesla intentions, but it was
And
there.
so you really advocate though for getting past the politics and trying to
Mhm.
find concrete solutions that will help both the climate as well as our own lives. So, in the culture and climate that we are living in, and we feel so incredibly divided, how in the world can you even start doing that?
Well, a couple things. First, I'm a really strong believer in wisdom of crowds. So, if you look at what are the climate and energy related policies that have, two-thirds or more support, it's things like, making power plants seal methane leaks. Um, in some surveys, taxing corporations, particularly energy producers based on their emissions. Um, but it's also supporting all of the above, right? So, not definitely
Mhm.
not broad support for banning fracking. It supports prioritizing keeping energy costs low over, transitioning a little bit faster, which um, I think roughly scans on to what is going to maximize our ability to be resilient. And then in terms of politicians, I actually think politicians in both parties have an incentive to come together on climate change. So for Democrats and liberals, I think, if you spent the last decade saying it's an emergency, in any other emergency, you're willing to make compromises in other areas and work together. So that this idea that, you have to have the what people call the omni cause. You have to have the climate policy that's perfect, that addresses every, social justice issue that you care about, however
Mm.
popular or not. Doesn't make sense. You should be pragmatic if you really think it's an emergency. For the right, I'd say two things. One is that we have a study, and there's lots of other data, I would argue, suggesting that do nothing on climate change is not a good position in elections. It hurts the party in elections. But also, I think now that we've gotten to a point where there's a lot of low cost climate mitigation and adaptation technologies, there really is at the margin a lot of win-wins for climate and the economy. And if we come up with a new technology that's going to, be the next big thing first, we get to export it to everybody. So it kind of turns the usual commons problem on its head. And so what I like to say to right-leaning groups is like, what would make America greater than continuing to lead the world in whatever the innovations of the future are, which certainly include clean technology, clean energy, and climate adaptation.
So before I let you go, I think a lot of this can be very overwhelming for people, right? So is there something that folks can do individually that would make a difference to society, that would help us and help the planet, but something that's doable, right?
Yeah, so two things. The I would say that the obvious thing, or the thing that's maybe intuitive, is there's lots of economic, environmental win-wins in your own life, right? So check your house's insulation, right? Check the insulation of your windows, right? These are things that can waste energy, which wastes money and increases emissions. In some areas, maybe look into solar, which can drastically reduce your electricity costs if you're in an area of high sun, right? The different whether or not you buy an electric vehicle, fuel economy in your vehicle is going to be good for both the planet and for the bottom line. And then the more counterintuitive thing I would say is calm down a little bit. I think polarization. One of the features of polarization is everybody, particularly people maybe who spend too much time on social media and online, think that everything's the end of the world. If you think about U.S. climate change, energy politics, if you go back to the George W. Bush Jr. administration, U.S. greenhouse gas emissions have been declining at a basically steady linear rate of about 1% per year, across Democratic and Republican administrations. Broad trends have been, economically favorable for oil and gas and renewables, and challenging for coal. And most of that has to do with the market and not whatever's going on in the White House. And so, when you hear your politicians say that either the other party is going to destroy the planet or the other party is going to destroy the economy with whatever their climate and energy policy is, I would say the data suggests that both of those people are wrong. And because the stakes are not existential, I think that actually gives us a lot of room to have rational discussions and try to come together and find common ground, without kind of working ourselves up into a panic and kind of an extremist lather.
Well, I want to thank you so very much for the conversation. We've been speaking with Dr. Matt Burgess. He's an assistant professor in the Department of Economics at the College of Business at the University of Wyoming. He will be speaking tomorrow on the topic of economic growth, climate change, and health at St. Luke's Lecture Series on Climate and Health. We'll, of course, put a link on our website, boisestatepublicradio.org. I'm Gemma Gaudette, and this is Idaho Matters.
Hi, it's Terry Gross, host of Fresh Air. Hey, take a break from the 24-hour news cycle with us and listen to long-form interviews with your favorite authors, actors, filmmakers, comedians, and musicians, the people making the art that nourishes us and speaks to our times. So listen to the Fresh Air podcast from NPR and WHYY.